GrowCFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using GrowCFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today at growcfo.net. Hello and welcome to the GrowCFO show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and today I've got Paul McKoen with me. Paul, hello.
Kevin, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be joining you on the CFO show this afternoon.
So, Paul, tell us just a little bit about yourself. You're an experienced CFO, but how did you get to where you are today?
Oh gosh, that's a very, very long story, Kevin.
That's all right. We've got all show to talk about it.
My early career was at Ford Motor Company. I was 11 years at Ford. I joined them straight from college. I was with them for about 11 years. The highlight of which undoubtedly was the year and a half I spent over in Cologne in their German operations, responsible for looking at the pricing in the German market. That was fascinating. Very much enjoyed that.
Yeah, I used to work as business accountant in a business in ICI that Ford was one of our main customers. We were producing polypropylene compounds for all sorts of clever new under bonnet technologies and anti-scratch interior grades and things like that. So very familiar with Ford and quite familiar from back then. Quality was the real thing then, and we had to get ourselves engaged and registered with Ford's Q101 quality standard, which was a revelation to us.
Yes, I remember that. That was industry leading at the time.
Yeah.
And I was the last piece of my Ford career was in the electronics division. At the time when the electronics were becoming a major part, with emissions and requiring under bonnet computers, and of course the engine compartment of a vehicle is a hugely hostile environment to anything electronic. So it needs to be sort of put in a secure box and properly protected from noise and vibration and all that kind of stuff. So
absolutely everything that can go wrong with electronics generally turns up under a bonnet.
Exactly. Yeah. Where it's hot, it can get wet. It's lots of vibration, so it's rattly. So all sorts of stuff that electronics really doesn't like.
So that took you through 11 years in Ford. So what sort of level were you at when you left Ford, Paul?
Well, sort of middle management grade, I suppose you'd call it. It was a time of quite a lot of change within that organization. My first job in the Ford business, when I started as a graduate trainee in 1982, there you go, that's aged me, hasn't it? Yeah. My first role there was manpower analysis. And we had something like 29,000 white collar employees in Ford across Europe. When I left, it was, which was 11 years later, it was half that.
Yeah.
So massive amount of change, lots of that driven by technology. And again, sort of, you almost can't picture it now, but when I joined, there was an office of about 7 or 8 of us, and we shared 2 computers.
Yeah, and I can relate with that. And you and I must be of a similar age, because 1982 I started my training contract to be a chartered accountant with BDO.
There you go.
And I remember the day that the first IBM PC turned up, and we all sat around looking at it and admiring this wonderful thing, and discovered that it had this thing on it called a spreadsheet. And it was 26 columns by 256 rows. And we thought this was a fantastic piece of analysis paper we could do stuff with.
We're going to start sounding like a couple of very old gits in a minute.
Yeah. But Paul, you've got to the end of that time at Ford. You're middle management, very much a finance guy, and that I suppose is where an awful lot of GrowCFO members find themselves these days, and wanting to make that transition from middle management up to board level, which is clearly something that you did very satisfactorily. So what happened between leaving Ford and where you are effectively now with many years of CFO experience to get you up to that next level?
I mean, I suppose really when you come down to it, it's my experience has been on the job training.
Yeah.
There was nothing like GrowCFO. You've done your accounting training. And I'd done CIMA when I was at Ford. Even though that wasn't particularly encouraged, it was sort of, well, we'll teach you all you need to know here was kind of the attitude.
But that kind of thing is not really transferable outside of Ford, is it?
Exactly. So I'd done CIMA while I was there. You'd done BDO, and you get your accountancy qualification. And then typically, I think at that time, and probably still the case, everything else you learned on the job, picked up as you went along, and learned from those around you.
Yeah.
Learned from peers, learned from bosses. I've had some outstanding people around me, and I've worked with some fantastic people over the years. And you learn from them, you learn by doing, and ultimately you learn from your mistakes as well a bit, don't you?
Yeah, I think you learn more from your mistakes, to be honest, Paul.
Sometimes you just have to bluff it out a bit. There was a piece I noticed. I'm not sure whether it was Catherine on GrowCFO, but imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And there's some stuff where you sort of have to think, well, you have to kind of put that aside and just get on and do your best. I can remember one bit of culture shock that was quite fun from Ford. And at Ford, the where you wanted to be was doing the analysis. So, I said when I was in Germany, I was doing pricing. That was an analytical role. The pure accounting was often done in a different building.
Yeah.
So I left Ford and I went to a services business called Serco, which you will have heard of. They do a lot of government contracts. They got very big on government outsourcing. And I'd not been there very long, and my financial controller, who'd been there ages, he said to me, we've got this transaction, got this entry we need to put in the accounts. Not sure where to put this. And I said, oh, well, we can make a case, we can put that in exceptionals or whatever it was. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I'm just wondering where to put the other side. The other side. Wait a minute. Debit, credit. Oh yeah. I'll have a think about that. Get back to you. Just throughout the entire history of my career with Ford Motor Company, I'd never once had to worry about a debit and a credit. It was all, about vehicles, or it was costings, or it was volumes and forecasts and.
That's right. That sounds very, very similar to my career in ICI as a business accountant. There's somebody else worried about actually doing the financial accounting.
Yeah.
My problem came when 2 profit and loss accounts turned up on my desk, one from UK and one from Holland, where we had our 2 manufacturing plants, and 10 other profit and loss accounts turned up from all the other countries that were currently in Europe, where we had sales offices. And Muggins' job was to put together a set of management accounts for the business. Yep. Never worried about the balance sheet. That was somebody else's problem.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you have to worry about consolidation adjustments and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So I worked at Serco for a bit. Left there, had a few months off, which is when I wrote my book, The Finance Manual for Non-Financial Managers, and that was inspired by some of the electronics engineers at Ford.
Right.
Who again were super bright electronics engineers, so almost literally rocket scientists.
Yeah.
But when you spoke to them, they had no idea about budgets, no idea about project appraisal, discounted cash flow, all that kind of stuff. Because why would they?
Exactly.
Nobody ever taught them that. Nobody ever even mentioned it.
So is that book still available, Paul?
I think we're certainly out of print now. I think you can still get some, but they're pretty much remaindered. But it was they did tell me at the time if it sold 5,000, it'd be considered a bestseller, and it did quite a bit more than that. So
yeah.
So it was quite fun at the time. So I then moved. That was when I left Serco. That was when I moved up to the Northwest. So I moved up to the Northwest in 1996, and I've been here ever since, just south of Manchester.
Right. See, I'd call that the North Midlands.
Well, there you go. There's a Scot talking.
And Geordie talking. If it takes longer to get there on the train than it takes to get to London, it's not in the north.
Oh, well, that's everybody's got their own different definitions, aren't they? But when I moved up, I joined part of United Utilities, which was a relatively recent combination of Northwest Water and Norweb, the electricity business, and so I moved up and found somewhere near the airport. So a place called Wilmslow, and one of my guys said to me, "Yeah," he said, "that's where that's the bloody Southerners live." So I called myself a bloody Southerner after that. But you can't win, can you?
You can't win at all. But that's quite a change, Paul. You've gone from automotive manufacturing to a big private sector outsourcer of government stuff. Now you've gone into a place that's effectively merging two utilities businesses together. Yeah, that's quite a jump across different industry groups.
Yes, although the logic for the United Utilities piece was they were creating so Serco had been business processes and business process outsourcing.
Yeah.
And in fact, what we were doing there, I was part of the international division. A lot of it was air traffic control.
Right.
Which is kind of fun. Buying insurance for air traffic control services is fun. But having done business process outsourcing, that's the link to the United Utilities business was they had created their own in-house business services division.
Yeah.
So things that the water company and electricity had in common were big chunks of IT, but also huge customer service areas.
Yes.
And also the accounting. So I ended up being FD for the services business and the director of accounting services for both Northwest Water and Norweb. Which, given that I've been struggling with debits and credits sort of 3 years before, was probably, as you say, quite elite. But it's there were some fairly big teams doing the doing. So I was literally looking at sort of people.
Running a shared services centre, you've definitely got a balance sheet there.
Yes, yeah, but it's also how you could bring those together and what bits you could commonize and where you could share costs and take costs out of the structure, because you could imagine with two very big utility companies relatively recently privatized, there were some fairly big chunks of costs that could be shared, which is
absolutely a whole load of duplication in finance functions, HR functions, procurement functions. You're in United Utilities. But that's not the end of your career, Paul, is it? You've moved on beyond there.
No, I did. So having done some fairly big, some fairly steady roles, I then moved out to a role in BICC, which is a business that nobody remembers anymore, but it owned Balfour Beatty. So it was the parent company for Balfour Beatty and a few others. And they were again doing some reorganization, and they had a comms cable division and a power cable division. And I joined the communications cable division, working for a super bright guy, and literally joined them at the time when, because they were floated in the city, they were being circled by a big breakup fund who'd done a sum of the parts valuation and concluded that the business was worth more in its component parts than it was as a whole. So literally months after I joined them, they were selling the division. So what was a sort of not standard, but a big divisional FD role became a disposal mandate within months of joining.
So a whole load of different experience again, Paul.
Yes.
So it puts you into find out how to dispose of a business. I guess all those due diligence sorts of things come up there, and providing data rooms and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd not really done. I'd done a small acquisition when I was at Serco, a small Canadian business. But again, I mean, people talk about planning your CV and planning your career, and it's largely hogwash.
I totally agree. The things that come along as opportunities, you would never, in my experience, certainly with mine, you'd never write down on a plan.
No.
It just happened.
No, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, literally, because I didn't join them to sell the division. I joined them, went through part of a budget process in the first few weeks, and then literally a fortnight after that was in a conference room in New York going through the first stages of the due diligence process, with them firing all sorts of questions at me. And I've been in the business literally less than 3 months.
Yeah, that's one hell of a learning curve to be answering all those due diligence questions on a business that you're only learning yourself.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of not sure, but I'll find out going on.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But a lot of it was also, what I'd learned fairly quickly. Unfortunately, the first bit I'd been doing was budgeting, but I'd also got sucked into costing, which was one of the little anecdotes I had for you, actually. Because one of the other things, apart from selling the business, one of the other things that we were looking at and that was frustrating the chief exec was we got a range of products, and with communications cables, a lot of what we were supplying were the big national utilities, pan-European. And he was fairly new to the business himself. He'd been there about a year and a half when he hired me, and was getting very frustrated because he kept spending quite a lot of time and resource putting in fairly big commercial bids for fairly big chunks of business, and kept losing. And some of the feedback he said was, well, you're too expensive. And so when I landed, he said, well, look, can you have a look at this for me? He said, because I've been through the costings and they all look fairly straightforward. I get it. I completely understand it. It all looks right. It all looks fine. But I'm being told we're too expensive. A couple of the competitors were pseudo public ownership. And the assumption was, well, are they bidding sort of at or below cost just because they want the business and just because they want, to keep the wheels turning? So I looked at the costing process, and there was a small team there of cost accountants, and the guy running it was quite commercial, and so I went through it, spent some time going through it, and they were doing all the right things. They got a pretty good grasp of the bill of materials, so they knew what the materials were costing them. So that was all fine. They'd got a pretty good grasp of how they were costing direct labor and machine hours and all this kind of stuff. So that all looked very sensible. And then they were doing an overhead allocation. So I was kind of looking at that. And the business, been through a rocky time. The business was, the volumes were at a depressed level. So I said to them, well, how are you assessing volume when you allocate overhead? And of course, they were doing overhead allocation on actual volumes.
Mm-hmm.
In a factory that was running at less than 50% capacity.
That rings an alarm bell.
So I had to have this philosophical conversation with them about, well, okay, so what happens if the volume falls a bit more? You're going to try and recover the same amount of overhead on less volume. Guess what's going to happen? Your costs are going to go up. Guess what's happening? Your volume's going to fall further. A few days worth of head scratching later, we come up with a notional overhead allocation based on a sensible forecast of what the factory should be doing.
Yeah.
So I went back to my CEO, who, as I said, was a super bright guy. I mean, sort of INSEAD MBA, spoke multiple languages, yada, yada, yada. And kind of the light went on. I went, oh shit, that's what I completely get it now. That's what we've missed. Da, da, da. And it was, guess what? We won the next bid.
You win the next bid. You put more capacity in the factory. And the amount of that overhead you're not recovering starts going down
Exactly.
and down and down. It's a big part of turning business around.
And I use it as an example of where you can end up looking at something that you weren't necessarily brought in to look at. And because you look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, never be afraid to challenge the assumptions that are being made. Because that costing department were doing nothing wrong.
Quite.
They were building the costs based on bills and materials. They were building the costs based on, actual routes and workload in the factory. And then they were allocating overheads based on what they thought the volumes were, which is what the actual volumes were. And on the basis of costing for existing customers, what they were doing wasn't wrong. What they hadn't done was thought about wait a minute, what am I actually producing this information for?
Yeah.
And what are the consequences of the information, etc. So it's just a fun example of how, when you go into a business and you look at things with new eyes, you'd never be afraid of challenging the assumptions, never be afraid of challenging the common wisdom.
Well, that's something that you've done on a good few occasions, gone into that new business. So any other lessons that you draw out of that? That's one story about sort of that very first period in there. Are there any other lessons you'd give to somebody joining a new business as a senior finance guy for the first time?
Well, I can give you another couple of sort of examples, which may or may not be useful, but it does come down to don't be afraid to ask questions of people. Don't be afraid to accept the fact that you're on a learning curve. Ask the questions, but then challenge the answers.
Yeah.
Because some of the answers will be because we've always done it that way. So another even so that was an example that actually comes to costing, which is sort of halfway up the syllabus if you're doing your accounting exams. One even simpler example was a manufacturing business that I joined, and they got into trouble. They'd lost the confidence of their bank. They'd overpromised and underdelivered. And their financial forecasts were basically, they put in a budget and then shortfall it. They put in a forecast and they shortfall it. And this had been going on for a couple of years. They'd lost the previous CFO. I joined them on an interim basis. I rolled up, and the second board meeting I attended, they'd been looking to try and get some private equity money in. And I'm sat around the table with 10, 11 other people who were all long-serving directors of the business. And one of them said, well, we've just had this feedback from the private equity investor who's not going to invest because they think our financial forecast is 3 million quid profit overstated. What are we going to do? Now, this is my second board meeting. And I'd gone into the business, and first thing you have a look at is what's the financial forecast, and what did we do last year, what did we do the year before, what we forecast in this year. And we just come to the end of our first quarter, and the forecast looked optimistic, not heroic, but definitely optimistic.
Yeah.
And I was very fortunate because I had a good finance team, and there was a guy at the center, and I said to him, look, just do me a favor. Can you lay out for me sales by quarter going back for the last 4 or 5 years? And I was saying to my chief exec, okay, so when you do the sales forecast, I get the financial and I get the cash and balance sheet. When you do the sales forecast, who does the sales forecast? Oh, the sales teams do it. Right. Okay. So who validates it? Well, what do you mean? It's the sales team do it. They know what we're going to sell to customer A and what we're going to sell to customer B. Okay.
Yeah, but sales teams, they're always very optimistic. They're always blowing their own trumpets. Yeah,
of course they are. So I'm having that conversation over there, and then my quarterly sales statistics come back, and what do you know? For the last few years, the percentage of sales of the full year in quarter 1 and quarter 2 and quarter 3 and quarter 4 is pretty consistent.
Yeah.
And we always did 26, 27% full year sales in quarter one. And guess what happened when I applied that rationale to this year's forecast?
You got the same.
We were 10 million quid overstated in our sales forecast, which at a margin of 30% was 3 million quid overstated on our bottom line. So fast forward to the board meeting, and there's a 3 million quid. So I'm sat there looking around the room, wondering if anybody else is going to contribute. And I'm on an interim contract here. I haven't actually joined them as a permanent employee at this point. So they're paying me by the day. I'm looking around, no one else. So I put my hand up. Oh, yes, Paul. Yes, it is Paul, isn't it? I said, well, I've got a fair idea why they might have come to that conclusion. They all look at me, well, how can you possibly know that? You've only been here 5 minutes. So I just, look, here are your sales by quarter. Here's your sales forecast. You know, bosh, overstated, bam, bam. And they're all looking around the corner saying, who's this? Who hired him? We don't like any of this stuff. Now that's simple arithmetic. That is the very simple moral of that story is an actual's quite likely to be an actual, but a forecast, pinch of salt. You need to look back at, well, what was the accuracy of previous forecasts? How was the forecast derived? As you said, who derived the forecasts?
Yep.
And in this business, the sales guys were building the forecast. Well, not only are sales guys, cheery, optimistic, glass half full types, and we love them for it. But also, the guy doing account A was building the account A forecast, and the guy doing account B was building the account B forecast. And account A was going to have a sales promotion, and account B was going to have a sales promotion. So they both put in their uplifts. Well, the total market wasn't going to go up.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've always got to have a degree of realism. I suppose another thing you could have looked at going back, and you probably didn't have the information, was not just what are your sales by quarter, but against each time, what was the sales forecast for that quarter? And I bet if you'd had that, Paul, you'd have found similar inconsistencies, that sales were always 10% or 15% higher than the real number that had come in.
Well, we'd had that, overall in the business, because that was why the bank had got pretty arsey with us, because they'd been getting this forecast that was up here, and then the actual would come in significantly below, and that had been going on for some time. Yeah. So that was a clear indicator, but it was.
Yeah, and shocks like that do come along and make things really happen to transform a business. And I remember going into in a similar way to you, going into something in an interim way to sort out some accounting problems on a couple of coal-fired power stations, because they weren't worried about profit. They were only worried really about cost of producing electricity, the cost of running the stations. And they'd been going in saying all year, we're on target, we're on budget, we're on budget, we're on budget, right until literally year end, 31st December, Christmas Eve. Oh, we're not going to hit budget by 2 million quid. Suddenly the parent company was overseas. Suddenly the UK company had a 2 million deficit in its accounts. That was material. Went back. Yes, it was a bit material to the overseas holding company. And basically there was a bit of a shitstorm. Muggins here was called in. I think it was at the end of, well, we think we've done a bit of an investigation to work out what's gone wrong. We need a whole load of stuff fixing. You do financial transformation, Kevin. Can you come in and fix it for us, please? Yeah. But, I can relate to all of that, going into new organizations, Paul, and finding stuff. And one of the bits of GrowCFO's future CFO program that I teach is the very last module, which is your first 100 days as CFO. And kind of in that module, we cover how should you approach those 100 days. And one of the key points is you're on a honeymoon period. You're the new guy. you've got a lovely piece of time there that you can get away with asking the stupid questions. Yeah.
That's definitely true. But you can make a fairly big difference fairly quickly. I mean, the beauty of the story I've just told you is that, having accepted the issue, we corrected the issue by building in central contingencies into the forecasting, went back to the bank, were candid with the bank, who, understood what we'd done, understood that we'd corrected the forward forecast, and we persuaded them to stay in.
Yeah.
So we turned a suspicious negative bank into one who understood and who stood by us for the next few years. So there's basically, you can find some negative stuff, but then by correcting it, you can have a significant positive impact on the organization.
Yeah. So you're there as an interim, Paul. Did they keep you on?
Yeah, when the bank refinanced, they wrote my name to the bank documents, so I didn't have a whole lot of
choice. So was that we got you in your career as far as BICC?
Yeah.
So was this one the next role after BICC?
No. So BICC, I then did a number of shorter term assignments. I did a really nice job in the travel sector. Again, they had a similar issue with forecasting and seasonality, because boy, is retail travel seasonal. I've worked in subsequent businesses, and people talk about seasonality, and they've got no idea what true seasonality is. The seasonality in the travel business on a retail is massive. You got this huge spike in January, February, as everybody sort of comes out at Christmas and books their summer holidays. This is all pre-COVID.
Yes.
And then you get another big spike coming into May and June. It's what they call the lates. But yeah, that was another interesting business where, again, you can come in and you can ask the stupid questions and get under the hood quite quickly, and start pointing out that forecasts could be better, if we're being polite. So I did some relatively shorter term assignments, which are great fun. So again, I would say to anybody early in their career, if you are between jobs, don't sniff at interim jobs, because interim jobs are a great way of getting expertise and knowledge of different sectors in a fairly accelerated timeline. But yeah, so I'd one of the next jobs along was, and this was a very strange business. It was called Barter Trust, and it ran barter exchanges, which aren't really a thing in the UK. In fact, that's one of the things they were trying to do, was to bring it into the UK. But this was a business that was we're talking 2000, 2001 dot-com boom, lots of money swishing about, and they were trying to do a roll-up.
Yes.
Because the strategy was to bring barter exchanges into the UK. They wanted a UK-based FD, even though most of the business was based in the States. So I joined them, found myself in the States. One of the things they were doing was moving the head office from San Francisco to Chicago. Yeah, stuff you can't possibly train for. So for a period of about 3 weeks, I had a corner office in San Francisco with a view of the bay, which was rather splendid. One of the things.
Hey, how did you do that one from Wilmslow?
Yeah, there was a fair bit of travel, fair few air miles involved. Not very carbon neutral, but we're talking sort of getting on for 20 years ago now. So one of the things I had to do there was sort of get us out of the property lease, because they leased 2 floors of this massively expensive high rise in downtown San Francisco. So I had to walk into the property agent and say, "You're going to have to let us off this lease, or I'm going to bust the company."
Yeah.
So that was a lesson. But then, and this is a very, very strange example that will be of no specific relevance to anybody listening to this podcast, but the principles are the same. When you run a barter exchange, you are running a mini economy.
Yes.
And the previous FD had presided over a period where the revenues of the economy were falling. And it was a slightly strange business in that there were some people who joined who were sort of, super young, private equity, we're going to grow this business, rah, rah, rah. There was some sort of more older experienced hands. And then there were the experienced owners of barter exchanges that we had acquired. So I sort of went around and had a chat with a few of these folks, and they said, well, and I said, well, what's happened? Why have some of these exchanges slowed down? And he said, well, because the previous FDs changed the rules. I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, we used to spend barter dollars in our own exchange economy. And he's told us we shouldn't be doing that. So that was quite interesting, because this guy had a central banker background. And when you think about a barter exchange, what you've got with barter exchanges, and if you don't know how they work, it's worth doing a search, because there's dozens, if not hundreds, in the United States. And they allow companies, typically regionally, to trade surplus goods and services. So typical users of a barter exchange will be limousine services, who've always got spare capacity, hotels, who've always got spare rooms, radio stations, who've always got spare airtime to advertise, laundry services, who can always do more. So it's businesses that typically have, significantly more capacity than they're typically utilizing, and it's a way of increasing utilization, trading amongst themselves in a local area. And it works really well. It's just never taken off in the UK, but it works really well in the States. So I started looking at this, and I thought, well, actually, what you're actually doing is you've actually got your own economy. And in the same way that an economy is allowed to print money, is allowed to stimulate an economy, and you've seen Rishi doing that, with all the COVID money that's being poured in.
Absolutely.
He's
throw a few £billion notes into it.
Spending money we haven't got in order to stimulate the economy. It was possible to do that within barter exchanges. So I basically wrote this up, took it to the auditors. The auditors were happy with it. Created a revised policy framework, which we then extended by creating a trading desk where we bought surplus goods as a company in real dollars and then sold them into the exchange for trade dollars. And of course, we made the commission. And a combination of this more than doubled the revenue of the business inside 12 months. And that came from literally asking the people who'd been in that business for a long period of time, what's changed, what works, what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then taking that on board and exploiting it.
And I think going back into what you do in your first 100 days as the new CFO, you go and talk to as many people as you possibly can.
Yes.
Find out as much as possible, and that's your own team that you've inherited. What works in finance, what doesn't work, what gives you the biggest problems, where's your bottlenecks, and go around all the other functions. Get their view on your finance function and what they give the rest of the business and don't. But the business in general, how does it work? How does it tick?
Yeah, because outside of the smallest startup, there is typically in any business of any maturity, there is a huge amount of accumulated wisdom.
Yes.
Often with the long-serving employees that newer managers have often given up talking to. And going and having those conversations, as part of induction, as part of learning curve, can be hugely valuable.
Yeah, that reminds me of another thing, kind of being a change guy. That old established employee that'll tell you when you've got this new initiative, that'll never work around here. Well, actually, he's the first person that I want to get on my business change team, please.
Yeah. Yes.
If I can convince him that something's worth changing, he'll convince the rest of the organization.
Well, and actually sometimes even better than that, because he'll say, well, when we tried it 10 years ago, it didn't work. Well, sometimes you can ignore that. The really interesting bit is when we tried it 10 years ago, it didn't work because ...
Exactly.
And that's the real information.
Yeah.
Because not that it didn't work.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Yes. Not that it didn't work last time, but why didn't it work last time?
Yeah, exactly. And now coming in as the new boy, you can ask all those silly questions. As we said, it's your perfect opportunity to find out. And now you've given a couple of examples there, Paul, of stumbling over a problem that was actually a very major problem to the business, except they hadn't quite got their head around it. And that classic one of the sales forecast is always wrong.
Oh yeah, I mean, inherently any forecast is wrong. It's just where it's consistently wrong. You need to establish why. Is there a systemic issue, and fix it.
Yeah, and that's it. And fix it is the important bit, because you keep on doing the same things. Guess what? You'll get the same outcomes.
Yeah, and that's where the CFO's role is an interesting one, because uniquely amongst the board, you've got the access to all the information. You've got access to all of the data, all the KPIs, and that gives you a unique insight into the operation of the business. So,
Paul, that's a fantastic career. Thinking about all of those things that you've been involved in, all those lessons that you've learned over time. I guess I go back to that. How did you get to where you were in Ford? And it was kind of, there were a lot of good people around you. You watched, you learned, you copied, you saw what they did. You took the bits that were good, you forgot the bits that were bad. Now, I know you've got to that point in your career, you want to pass on an awful lot of that to the next generation. So if somebody was approaching you potentially as maybe a mentor, what's that special ingredient that you think you've got to offer?
Oh gosh, that's the $64 million question.
It certainly is. I'll even give you. I think we'll cut the recording for a second.
Kevin, yes. Look, I've been hugely fortunate. I've been very fortunate in my career. Not every career goes as you planned it, and we've already talked about that. Yes, I've had setbacks. Yes, I've been made redundant. But you respond to that, and you make the best of it. So, net, when you look back a bit, I've been incredibly fortunate. Yes, I've learned quite a bit of stuff along the way. One of the things you learn is, try not to be arrogant, try not to be a smart ass. So when you get asked a question like, why would somebody want me to mentor them? You think, well, you don't want to come across as being sort of brash or in any way not humble, because I think, humility is important.
But there's a couple of things there I'd pick up on already, Paul. You said you've been made redundant. Well, actually, I'd argue you've never been made redundant. Your job has been made redundant. You haven't.
Well, that's true as well.
And no, you're there. You've had a lot of good fortune. I remember one of my sort of role model heroes, South African golfer Gary Player, and one of the things Gary Player says: the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Yes, but you do need some good fortune. You need to be in the right place at the right time. So what would I say to somebody who might be interested in speaking to me? I've had a lot of different experience across different sectors, and again, one of the things I've learned is that whilst some of the skills of the CFO are transferable, working across different sectors does give you an experience and a perspective where you can see into things more quickly. So I'm used to being able to see issues and problems reasonably quickly, and also used to trying to find ways of turning those into opportunities. I've worked with a wide range of different people and different skill sets. So, you know, I've built up techniques which enable me to relate to different people and different styles of management, which I think is important. And I think for FDs and CFOs generally, I think it is important for them to have somebody who they can bounce things off, and that person, you know, definitely isn't their boss, often isn't the chairman, often aren't peers with whom you have a sort of a inherently slightly competitive relationship. So I think, you know, it is valuable to have somebody that you can bounce things off, and you know, I would hope to be able to play that role, and I think it's something I can do and add value.
So Paul, I wish you every success in taking that angle of life forward, and I can just see you've got so much there to potentially hand over to the next generation. It's a real great place to be. Paul, thank you very much for being our guest on this week's GrowCFO show.
Kevin, thank you so much. I've enjoyed speaking to you.